Welcome to Pick Me Up, I'm Scared, the podcast.
I'm your host, Madeline.
And I'm your co-host, Kenna.
Okay, Kenna, today I wanted to start out by giving you an informal psychological evaluation.
Oh, no.
Are you game?
Yeah.
All right. It's a 20-part questionnaire.
Oh, geez.
Yeah, it's a long one. It's basically professional.
Actually, I love those, like, quizzes online where they're like, which Kardashian are you?
Yes.
And I'm Kim.
Yes, so it's kind of like that. This is kind of an interesting segue off of our personality quiz episode. But not really, but kind of.
Okay.
I'll just dive into the questions. It'll make sense.
That sounds good.
All right. Okay. Number 1. Would you say that most people are polite when you first meet them?
Yes.
Okay, that's interesting. That might be because you have glib and superficial charm, so that's good to know. Okay, so next. Would you say that you hate yourself and you're the worst person in the world and definitely deserve to be treated poorly by everyone all the time?
Part of my brain says yes.
Well, I think that might mean that you have a grandiose sense of self then. All right, next step. Would you say that you ever get bored? Or distracted?
It's rare, but sometimes.
Okay, so you need constant stimulation, then, is what that means. All right. Have you ever told a lie?
Never.
Never? That's a lie.
I've lied.
Wow. Okay,
I've definitely lied.
I think that's going to be a big problem on this, then. I think we're running into issues. Okay, have you ever done well in a job interview?
Yeah.
So that's cunning and manipulation, so that's a check.
I don't even remember the last job interview I did.
Have you ever been picking at the bins and grabbed something you knew someone else wanted, but you were happy that you got it and not them?
Not if it was in their hand.
No, just something you saw.
Oh, I mean, yeah. I mean, there's only one thing in the whole, yeah. I mean, sure.
So that would be a lack of remorse. Yikes. Oh, wow. All right. Next. Okay. What do you do when someone you don't really want to be talking to has trapped you in a conversation? Do you tell them you don't want to talk to them, or do you politely smile and nod your way through it?
I nod my way through it and then usually daydream about talking to someone else.
Wow.
Or I just dig in and try to find some topic that's interesting.
Okay, so that would be, I think that's shallow affect.
Damn.
All right, next up. Have you ever thought to yourself, I don't care, when reading or listening to something?
I'm sure, yeah.
Yeah, so that definitely would be callousness and lack of empathy, I think. Okay, next. Has anyone ever helped you with anything?
Yes.
Wow, parasitic lifestyle. Wow, that's what that one is. Okay. Have you ever lost your temper before?
When I was a kid, I lost my temper all the time. I once high-sticked another child in PE when I was like 6.
What's a high stick?
Okay, so when you're playing street hockey,
like you do, like every child does. Is this common?
I was really good at street hockey. I don't know if this is a Colorado thing.
Okay, I love
or
this.
like a 90s thing. But I whacked this other kid with a hockey stick.
So what you're saying is yes to poor behavioral controls, basically. I don't think that one's going to be good on this either. I don't think that's...
I remember the other kid was a dick, though, to be fair.
All right. So that's how... maybe that's all right. Okay, have you ever had premarital sex?
If my mom is listening, no.
Okay, so promiscuity, yes. Is that what okay. Did you ever get into trouble as a child?
I did, but very rarely.
All right. So we do have early behavioral problems.
Oh, my mom said I was good.
Okay, we're almost done, I promise. Okay. Do you ever think that you will retire from working one day?
I fucking hope so. I hope that work is not a thing by the time I'm old.
Wow, lack of realistic long-term goals. Okay, have you ever been on vacation without first making an itinerary for each day that you were gone?
Oh, I've rarely been on vacation, but yes, I'm guessing.
The impulsivity.
Yeah.
Is that one? That's really impulsive of you. Have you ever paid a bill late before?
Oh, fuck yeah.
irresponsibility. Wow. All right. We're almost done. Has anything bad ever happened to you that was not your fault?
Yes.
Wow. Failure to accept responsibility for your own actions. This is really shocking. Your answers. I'm learning so much that I didn't know. How many relationships have you had in the past?
I think we did this at work the other day.
6, yeah. Many short-term relationships. Got it. Wow. Did you ever shoplift as a child?
Actually, never.
Okay. All right. So no to juvenile delinquency then.
No. I honestly, I don't think I ever stole anything as a kid. I think once, I even as I think I don't even remember any times that I've ever stolen anything.
Well, okay, that's saving you then a little bit on this questionnaire because everything else so far has been real bad. Real bad.
I know.
2 left. Were you ever allowed to do something, but then someone changed your mind and said you actually couldn't do it?
I don't know.
Okay. All right. We'll give you a no on that one too.
I kind of didn't understand the question. I kind of lost.
It's complicated.
I lost
complicated.
focus.
That's okay. And then last, have you ever done a drug?
If my FBI agent is listening, no.
No. Okay. All right. And have you ever jaywalked?
Fuck yeah.
Okay.
I live in LA. There's no crosswalks.
So what we have here is some criminal versatility. So taking into account the 2 answers that you said no to, just tallying up your score here, it's 36. I regret to inform you, Kenna, that based on these answers, you are indeed a psychopath.
It kind of makes me feel cool because I definitely feel too boring to be a psycho.
Well, this all must mean that today we are talking about psychopathy.
Ooh.
Yeah, thank you for bearing with the long intro. I thought it would be fun.
I love a quiz. So this BuzzFeed quiz says that I'm Patrick Bateman from American Psycho.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Who I do not identify with at all, but if the quiz says so, I guess.
I mean, that's what it says, so I'm pretty sure. I mean, you've got criminal versatility, you've got parasitic lifestyle, you have promiscuity, you've got them all. You really ranked high there. Okay, wait, so Kenna, let's get into the actual bulk of what it means to be a psychopath. And you're an expert now.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, so what do you think of when you hear the term psychopathy besides like American Psycho?
I think when I was younger, or like serial killers, like people who are grifters, like the Tinder swindler, or like people who like put on these like elaborate grifts and just kind of don't give a shit about anybody. But I feel like the older I get, it seems like a catch-all term that kind of seems too vague to mean anything. Like, and it just seems like a lot of reasons why we have like jails and laws and stuff, because like, what about the psychos? All the psychos out there, like there are all these children that are born evil to just run amok like little demon goblins, and then they turn into adult demon goblins and just fuck up everything for everyone.
Yeah, so basically you nailed it. That's 100%. That's pretty much what,
Yay!
Yeah.
But also I'm a psycho, so I could be gaslighting you.
You could be, but also you could know your own.
Oh my god.
So the mainstream definition of psychopathy is that it's a neuropsychiatric disorder marked by deficient emotional responses, lack of empathy, and poor behavioral controls, commonly resulting in persistent antisocial deviance and criminal behavior. So that's pretty much what you said. And this is taken from a paper called Psychopathy, Developmental Perspectives and Their Implications for Treatment by Nathaniel E. Anderson and Kent A. Keel.
Okay.
Yeah, so they're experts. And this sounds super official, right? Like, it's got the word neuropsychiatric in there. It's got to have both neurology and psychiatry on its side, right? Telling us that, yes, psychopathy is a real and diagnosable thing and it is very serious and we need to care, right?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so have you ever heard of the psychopath checklist?
I have not.
Or the psychopath test?
No.
All right, so there's this whole checklist for figuring out if someone's a psychopath. And it's called the Psychopath Checklist, or more specifically, the Psychopath Checklist Revised, PCL-R, which is basically just a diagnostic tool to rate someone's psychopathic tendencies. And that's what I gave you at the beginning of this episode.
Oh, no. Oh, no.
So when you look the psychopathy checklist up in an encyclopedia, it tells you what you're testing for. And it says, psychopaths are people who prey ruthlessly on others using charm, deceit, violence, or other methods that allow them to get what they want. The symptoms of psychopathy include lack of conscience or sense of guilt, lack of empathy, egocentricity, pathological lying, repeated violations of social norms, disregard for the law, shallow emotions, and a history of victimizing others.
Wow, okay.
That's like in an encyclopedia. That's pretty shocking to me because that doesn't sound very academic or encyclopedic.
Yeah.
It sounds kind of like both legit and terrifying, though, right?
Yeah, because it kind of seems like a lot of traits that are just part of our society.
Yeah, it's just kind of like human stuff.
Or just like American stuff.
Yeah, that too. Yeah, for sure. So this test basically is a 20-item symptom rating scale that's supposed to allow you to figure out if, someone's a psychopath. Now, this is called the Hare Psychopath Checklist, like Hare, and it's named after the guy who kind of made it. And it basically was used originally to assess people who are convicted of crimes, specifically. So it's interesting that you brought up the thing about how it's kind of a catch-all for crime.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's still kind of used just for that. It's often employed in prisons, criminal psychiatric hospitals, and for people who are like awaiting psychiatric evaluations in trial type settings or in other correctional and detention facilities. So we see right away that this is a tool employed by the carceral prison state, right? And it's true that the PCL-R is now used in courtrooms and trials as an indicator of the potential risk posed by like prisoners or inmates or people, who've been convicted of crimes. So they'll give someone this test, which is basically like a glorified BuzzFeed quiz, and say, look, based on how this person scored, they're a really bad type of person, and we should not give them parole or an easy sentence or whatever. And they use it to decide how long and severe someone's prison sentence actually is, which is where it starts to feel a bit dystopian, to say the least.
Yeah, like, wait, what? Like, being late on a bill?
Yeah, irresponsibility. And it's pretty much a way of, like, justifying keeping people in prison longer than you might otherwise if you just assess them on the basis of the crime they committed, like, on its own. And these decisions can be life-altering or even life-ending in terms of capital punishment cases. Getting labeled as a psychopath in a courtroom setting can be devastating in our criminal justice system. So this checklist, it can be traced back to this guy named Felipe Pinal, who's often considered the founding father of modern psychiatry. I feel like we've done other episodes, though, and talked about other dudes who were also called the founding fathers of modern psychiatry, and I feel like they just kind of call any old dead guy the founding father of whatever he did.
Yeah, it kind of seems like that, yeah.
Right? So whatever, this guy lived from 1745 to 1826, and in his work in 1801, he first described a subset of people that he was studying, who were people affected with mania sans delire, or insanity without delirium. And these were people with no intellectual developmental disabilities, but an emotional developmental issue, which he described as marked by acts of cruelty and antisocial behavior, yes, but also just with things like alcohol and drug use, irresponsibility, and a general idea of immorality, whatever that means. So it was a combination of behavioral observations, but put through the lens of social convention of that time. And Pinel called this moral insanity.
Whoa, yeah. It sounds like I'm just thinking of Jamiroquai's virtual insanity.
Yeah, it's like that, but the old, dead, maybe French guy version. So while psychosis came along with a loss of contact with reality that included hallucinations, delusions, and disordered thoughts, things we often see come along with things like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and even sometimes major depression, this new type of issue, psychopathy, was not psychosis as we think of it. So these people were not psychotic, right? They were something totally different. And in 1888, German psychiatrist J.L.A. Koch coined a new term for these people, and he called them psychopastiche, or psychopath. Koch claimed that psychopathy came about as a flaw deep within someone from the day they were born. This is that thing you were talking about, the little goblin children.
So born little baby golems.
Yes,
goblins.
exactly. So in that nature versus nurture convo, he was on team nature. And people became really interested in this idea. So it was like a natural tendency to be bad, right? And it just kind of replicated a lot of religious ideas that were kind of popular at the time about like absolute evil in the world. And according to him, yeah, some people were just born bad, little demon goblin, and now there was a new way to categorize them. Thus, constitutional psychopathy became a popular disorder in the literature of the early 1900s.
Okay, this is kind of weird to me because my parents were religious, so I had to go to church growing up, and the whole thing was like, babies are born good, the world just makes them bad. So now I'm really confused.
Oh, yeah, No, this thing that started to come up that was popular was the idea that certain people are just bad and you gotta throw the whole person away.
Yeah, it's not, it couldn't be the system that we're living in. No. It's all personal accountability.
Exactly. So Koch thought to adequately assess psychopathy as an issue of moral insanity, he needed to have a holistic appraisal of the patient's life history. So he developed a strategy to assess personality traits, which was found in the 8th edition of Emil Kraepelin's book on clinical psychiatry. The diagnosis of psychopathy was pretty broad and did include people who hurt themselves and others. So by the 1920s, the term psychopath was being used by psychiatrists, but it had kind of gotten so broad that, like you said earlier, they just started to use it kind of as like a catch-all to describe any sort of abnormal psychology, which included depression and other personality traits like being weak-willed, shy, or insecure.
Whoa, okay.
Yeah, so if you were shy, you were a psychopath.
Okay.
If you had depression, you were a psychopath.
Oh man, these poor, shy, depressed people.
Right. If you were insecure, psychopath.
Oh my God. I mean, but who am I to talk?
Right. You are, in fact, our resident psychopath now, the expert. So as early as 1909, Carl Birnbaum started to push back on this idea. And he was like, I don't know if people are just born bad. I think that antisocial behavior rarely comes from just a flaw in a person's character. Instead, he thought that antisocial behavior came from social forces that make it more difficult for certain types of people to just learn like what are or are not acceptable forms of behavior. So he thought that because of this, a better term for these type of antisocial behaviors would be sociopathy. However, even with this change, the term was still too broad to be useful, and literally every criminal met the criteria for sociopathy as it was defined because they had committed a crime and thus broken social convention. So this showed a direct link to these efforts to pathologize criminal behavior. So while sociopathy and psychopathy both had the same set of symptoms, sociopathy connoted social origins, while psychopathy implied the potential for a fundamental biologic failure as the driving force. But psychopathy did say that, yes, social factors could weigh in. So slowly, sociopathy as a term fell out of favor in academic and medical circles, but we still, to this day, see people use both in nearly interchangeable capacity, even though we just kind of stick with the idea of psychopathy today, right? Mm-hmm. And that whole thing about nature versus nurture, well, that's something scientists have been trying to figure out for years, right? About everything. But they found out that the types of people who end up categorized as psychopaths tend to have a genetic predisposition towards those traits, as well as environmental factors contributing to their development. So one major prevalent childhood development that contributes to positive psychopathy assessments would be early sexual or physical abuse or maltreatment in childhood. So according to one article, these factors increase the risk of antisocial behavior, particularly aggression, reactive to fear or frustration, as well as the increased emotional reaction to any sort of threatening stimuli, which is really sad. It makes sense. It's like a defense mechanism. Additionally, brain imaging studies associate psychopathy categorizations with abnormalities of the amygdala, orbital frontal cortex, and extended paralimbic structures of the brain. These areas of the brain can affect associative learning, which is thought to be crucial to healthy socialization. And this correlation may explain why head trauma can be a cause of these traits we associate with psychopathy today, especially if damage occurs when a person is young before they've had a chance to learn what's considered appropriate behavior. So brain damage in these areas can be linked to a lack of empathy, a poor response to fear and distress, and a lack of self-conscious emotions like guilt or embarrassment. And you can get all of those from a head injury, right? So in one study, it was shown that over 1 in 5 people convicted of murder suffered from these types of head injuries in childhood. And you know all those famous serial killers you were talking about that the media likes to sensationalize and we all call them psychopaths and we're like, I fear them. Well, it turns out a lot of them had head injuries in their developmental childhood years. So people like Richard Ramirez, John Wayne Gacy, Alexander Pichushkin, David Berkowitz, Albert Fish, Ed Gain, Glenn Edward Rogers, Peter Sutcliffe, aka the Yorkshire Ripper, Henry Lee Lucas, Dennis Rader, and more. And obviously that doesn't excuse their behavior, but it does go to show that the idea that people are just born wrong doesn't actually carry a lot of traction from a medical perspective.
Yeah, now I'm very afraid to fall off a ladder and bonk my head.
It's pretty scary. I think it's worse when you're younger, though, because you're still developing social convention. Although there have been stories about people who were in their 40s and 50s who got a head injury and then their entire personality changed.
Yeah, I was listening to some podcast where it's like a famous example where that guy got like a railroad spike in his head.
Yes.
And then he like became like, he was like this nice, just normal guy. And then he just became like a total asshole and started gambling all the time. And like, yeah, it's scary.
It's pretty scary, for sure. I think what's interesting, though, is like pretty early on, the idea, like first we have people who are like, criminals, there's got to be something wrong with their brain. Why are they doing crime? And it can't be like, oh, because they're poor. Statistically, most people do crime because they're poor. They're like, nah, there's got to be something wrong with their brains. So then we're like, oh, they're born bad. And I do like that this guy was like, I think it might be environmental factors, but he didn't land on poverty. He was just like, they're not socialized right. And I think it's interesting that only now that we have like the brain scan technology, we're able to see like, oh yeah, whatever the environmental factors are, or like physical trauma or whatever, it does actually change the way people's brains process information.
Yeah, and I'm going to have a galaxy brain moment, and I'm thinking this on the fly, but it's like basically like the system or the environment that you're set up in, like the behavior is within that system. So it's like, yeah, you're going to do crime if the system that you're set up in allows the crime of like property theft because there's property, or like, you know, the idea of like hierarchical power where like violence is acceptable. You're going to do violence because in some way it is acceptable.
Yeah, exactly. And if you add on top of that the fact that like, you know, we think of the psychopaths as the serial killers. In our head, they're the same, but serial killers are super rare, right? Like less than 1% of all murders are committed by serial killers. And out of all deaths in 2020 in the US where we live, only 0.7% were homicides at all. So that's like less than 1% of deaths are attributed to people we think of as these psychopathic serial killers. And what we find is, in fact, that most murders committed are committed for motives of love, lust, hate, or robbery. Which sure could be the result of psychopathic motives, like hatred and robbery, like, I just want things and I hate everyone. That's what we think of as, like, the psychopaths. But also just kind of sounds like pretty human motives, right? Which doesn't make it excusable, but it also means that murders aren't statistically the result of some mythical monster hiding behind a mask of humanity. It's like you said, if you live in a place where you have to steal things in order to have a good life, it's going to be a pretty human response to try to steal a little so you can have a good life and survive.
Or just the idea of like the violence of capitalism.
Right.
Like, you know, companies doing like terrible things in the name of capitalism. Like you think about the Industrial Revolution and like how just companies would do so much fucked up shit to like workers, and just like, or like the idea of like kind of like the Patrick Bateman idea of like the 80s businessman who like cuts all his employees and raises the shareholders' profit, and he gets rewarded with women and cocaine.
Yeah.
You know, like if people think it's like, oh, this is done in a vacuum. No, it's like it in some weird way the society allows it.
Yeah, capitalism is the psychopath.
There's
one psychopath. It's capitalism.
I feel like every episode is like the Scooby-Doo where we take off the mask and it's capitalism.
It's capitalism, yeah. So despite the fact that this whole serial killer thing we associate with psychopathy is actually super fucking rare, our culture is still obsessed with this idea of the serial killer and the idea of the psychopath as like an inhuman entity, right? So in 1941, this guy, Dr. Hervey Cleckley, published a book called The Mask of Sanity, which was a compilation of clinical research and case studies on people who had been classified as psychopaths by their community and in institutional settings. Cleckley's book outlined the mask that psychopaths wear, showing others that they might be sane and exist in a non-delusional capacity, but in reality, they are actually suffering from a psychiatric defect that makes them horrible, scary monsters for everyone else to be around, basically is the gist of the book. The book has gone through 4 different editions and still remains used today in describing psychopathy. So, drawing on Cleckley's book, in 1980, Dr. Robert Hare, remember, the guy from the checklist, he started working on, the PCL, the psychopathy checklist. And this was used to assess if criminals fit the description of psychopathy as Cleckley described it. Harry even developed a version of the PCL just for children called the PCL-YV, or youth version, to be given to kids between the ages of 12 and 18.
Oh my God.
I know, it's pretty wild.
Leave the children alone.
Leave the children alone. So the revised version of the regular PCLR launched in the early 1990s, and now it has 2 parts. There's an interview, and then there's a review of the subject's records and personal history. And an interesting thing here is that even if the subject refuses to participate in the interview portion of the test, the clinician can still assess them based on their public records and personal history alone, which sounds a bit weird, right? Like, we would consider it pretty unethical today in most situations for a mental health professional to diagnose someone without talking to them.
Yeah, what the fuck?
Yeah, but despite that, the clinician scores the recipient on 20 items thought to measure central elements of the psychopathic character. And yeah, they can do this without ever actually talking to the person. So this kind of brings us to what the 20 elements of the checklist are, which I asked you questions. I'll admit it, I asked some leading questions.
Yeah. I think you did.
I think I did, to inaccurately make Kenna sound like a psychopath, which might have been psychopathic of me. Whoa. But I used it to kind of show how open-ended I think these questions are. Like, anybody could fit into these questions, a lot of them. So here are the elements. The first one is glib and superficial charm. The second one is grandiose estimation of self. The third one is a need for stimulation. I mean, I have that. I think that's just because we have ADHD, though, right? The fourth one is pathological lying. I might have had this one in the past because when I was a child, I did that thing where I convinced my entire preschool that I was from France and I could speak French. I just didn't want to.
When I was 5 and I moved into a new town, I told the neighbor lady that my name was Cupcake.
That's so cute.
Because I was like, I have a new life now. I'm Cupcake.
I'm Cupcake. That's a good name. You're so good at picking out names, though.
Not to toot my own horn, but beep beep.
What was the name you came up with last week when we were in Vegas?
Oh, for a kid?
Yeah.
Either Happy Choo Choo Train
or
Happy Choo Choo.
Happy Choo Choo. Happy Choo Choo.
Or Sunny Yoda.
Sunny Yoda. They're both such great names. Okay, so the next one is cunning or manipulativeness, but that's pretty vague, right?
I mean,
we all have to exercise cunning in some elements of our life.
I think working retail, like, there always is some element of, like, not that you're lying, but you're just like, do you want to buy this?
Yeah, that's what sales is, right? You're trying to manipulate people into thinking they need something they don't need.
But it's like, but even sometimes they're like, you don't need this. I don't know about this. Like, you're fine without it. They're like, but I want it. And I'm like,
yeah.
Wait, did I just, like, reverse psychology you?
Maybe. And then the next one is a lack of remorse or guilt. Then there's shallow affect, which is like superficial emotional responsiveness. And then there's callousness and lack of empathy. Then there's parasitic lifestyle. And then the next one is poor behavioral controls, which I definitely have that one too. I definitely have the poor behavioral controls. The next is sexual promiscuity, so I got that one too. Then there's early behavioral problems, which, yeah, also me. Then a lack of realistic long-term goals, which definitely still my issue. Then there's impulsivity, which over the holiday I tried to convince my boyfriend's entire family that we all needed to immediately move to Malta. So
that would be cool.
I think I have that one. Also an ADHD thing, I think.
Yes.
Yeah, and then I have irresponsibility, so that's also definitely me in lots of situations. Then there's failure to accept responsibility for your own actions, many short-term marital relationships, but people don't really get married so much anymore. So
I mean, we talked about this before, still like a large percentage of marriages fail.
Right. And then there's juvenile delinquency, which I also had. I had that one.
I plead the fifth.
Then there's revocation of conditional release. That was a question you didn't understand. I was trying to set up a question where it would apply to us, but it's just a prison question. It's if somebody let you out on parole and then they were like, never mind, come back, you did a bad. That would be on the test.
I mean, I'd probably just come back because I'm just like, fuck, like, if I don't come back, then I'm going to get, like, extra time added on.
Well, yeah, also, though, it's, like, so hard to exist when you leave prison. It's, like, hard to get a job, hard to go anywhere, hard to live places.
Oh, yeah, the probation system is, like, fucked.
Yeah.
Like, it's, like, they make it so it's, like, basically unless you have like the perfect situation, you are going back to jail.
Right. And then the last one is criminal versatility. This one could have been me too, but I don't really know what counts as criminality. Like, I've assaulted a police officer, done illegal drugs, and shoplifted. So I think that makes me like a versatile criminal mastermind, according to this list or something.
I have jaywalked.
Yes, jaywalking. So yeah, these are the questions, and this is what the person administering the test is looking for. But just like I tried to prove when I interviewed you, if you're looking for something, you can find a way to see it in there. You know, it can be something super mild, but all of these things are super open to interpretation, and you could basically decide anybody you're talking to is a psychopath based on this list.
Yeah, and especially if you're part of like a marginalized group, I could see how you could turn this into something of like, well, you're a psycho.
Yeah, exactly. And these questions, they're supposed to measure the subject's interpersonal relationships, emotional involvements, responses to other people in certain situations, overall lifestyle, and what people call evidence of social deviance, which sounds pretty vague to say the least. But the goal is to cover two key aspects to help define who is and is not a psychopath. And those two are, one, selfish and unfeeling victimization of other people, and two, an unstable and antisocial lifestyle. Now, they do warn that professionals who administer the diagnostic examination should have advanced degrees like an MD or PhD in a medical, behavioral, or social science field, and also be registered with a reputable organization that oversees psychiatric or psychological testing and diagnostic procedures, and have experience working with convicted or accused criminals or several years of some sort of other on-the-job training. Because, let's face it, this test is used a lot in courtrooms in legal cases. So whomever administers it needs to be qualified to serve as an expert witness in the courtroom, because that's basically what they're using these things for. And they also think you should have at least two people administer this test independently and then average the test results together to get a score. So I guess what they're saying is that kind of the test I gave you earlier would not hold up in a court of law.
Thank goodness.
So anybody hearing this, Kenna is not a psychopath.
And it's okay.
It's okay. But the scores are given based on these 20 characteristics we talked about, and for each one, the subject can be scored 0, 1, or 2 based on how well it applies for them, meaning that you could score anywhere between 0 to 40 on this test. And even though I'm not supposed to judge myself, I did actually realistically judge myself on this, and not the way I set it up for you. Like, I actually thought about this. Like, okay, if I was a professional looking at me objectively with my records, what would I score? And there was one question I kind of got hung up on if I was a 1 or a 2. So in the end, I decided that I scored around a 20 or a 21 on this test, which is about half, right? Half of the 40 mark that's possible. And that actually puts me about on par with the general population of a men's prison, where the average score is 22 for the inmates.
Whoa!
Yeah. The average person, though, just existing outside of prison, they usually score around a 4.
Whoa.
I know. So 99% of the general population existing outside of a carceral or psychiatric institution does fall somewhere under a score of 30. But anyone over 30, that would be between 3 to 21% of CEOs, depending on your evaluation metric, and 15 to 25% of incarcerated individuals. Anyone over 30 is said to fall in the psychopathy range.
Huh.
So some references I found online even said that people who fell into this range, they would be diagnosed as a psychopath. But there's a problem here. Do you know what it is? There are 0 formally properly medically diagnosed psychopaths in the world.
What?
And the reason for that is that it is not a psychological diagnosis.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Here I thought there's all these psychos running around when I was younger.
According to Psychopathy, Historical Controversies and New Diagnostic Approaches by Nadika Buzina, psychopathy as a diagnostic entity or construct was reserved mostly for the group of perpetrators of crimes in whom no therapeutic options could be considered. So basically, it's a criminology term, not a medical term.
Interesting.
See, for all of its implementation in the prison and court and carceral systems, actual psychiatric medical diagnoses, they come from this thing called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, aka the DSM. It's a handbook used by healthcare professionals in the US and lots of other places in the world, and it's pretty much considered the definitive authority on mental disorders. And psychopathy wasn't even mentioned in it until 2016, at which point it was added in not as an officially accepted clinical diagnosis, but instead is a specifier or descriptor used to assess and diagnosing a different actual disorder.
Whoa, I like this idea that it's only used in criminology, because it's just like, well, there are certain people who will never ever get better and who can never be reintegrated back into society, and nothing will ever work. That's why we have to lock them up and torture them.
No, that's exactly what it is. Yeah. So the main reason that it wasn't allowed to be included in the DSM is that lots of psychiatrists had doubts about the average clinician's ability to reliably detect things like lack of empathy, guilt, or remorse. While Hare and others, including doctors Livesley and Schroeder and Widgier and Corbett, thought that they could actually assess these things in like an objective capacity, the American Psychiatric Association conducted field studies and found it only warranted a slight compromise to even try to include this criminology idea of psychopathy into the DSM. But they couldn't justify adding it as an actual diagnosis, and they instead just basically put a footnote like, hey, if you're working in like a criminology setting and you know what like psychopathy is, it could be a subset type helping you diagnose this other disorder that's real and different.
I just don't know how you could accurately measure things like empathy and stuff, because it seems to me that there would be some sort of bias in there by each researcher. Because I think if you ask each person like what empathy is, you might have a different answer. Granted, I am not a statistician, I am not a mathematician, but that seems like that's something that like falls into the thing that we were talking about with our episode about AI, where the people who make these decisions have biases built in already.
They do. And there are some things that are a little bit more objective in mental health that they try to use to classify actual disorders. So there is one disorder that is the most similar to what people think of as psychopathy, and it is in the DSM, and it is an actual diagnosis. Do you know what it is? Can you think of what it is?
Something, I don't know.
No? Okay, it is called antisocial personality disorder.
Oh, I was going to say some sort of personality disorder.
Yeah, so as it turns out, a lot of the things that we think of as being psychopathic or sociopathic, it's just kind of lore. It's like used in a colloquial way and not really the medical categorization we think of, because, yeah, they're just subjective and vague. So what we're actually describing is behavior that could be used in diagnosing this very real thing according to the DSM, which, yeah, is antisocial personality disorder, or ASPD. And the thing about ASPD is that it's not identical to what we think of as psychopathy or sociopathy, because those are a little less clinical of ideas, more rooted in general feelings we have about people from a criminal justice or crime perspective, rather than a true neurological or psychiatric perspective. There's actually only around 3 categories that overlap between psychopathy and ASPD. So what exactly is ASPD then? Well, it's a personality disorder that can manifest as early as 10 years old, but isn't usually diagnosed until 18. And in childhood, it can be marked by things like setting fires, hurting animals, bullying, intimidating, theft, etc. But it also could be a lot more mild than that. It's also marked by some genetic traits. Between 38 to 69% of people inherit certain genes from their parents that make them predisposed towards this type of personality disorder, but also marked by environmental factors as well. So, for example, somebody could have genetically inherited the traits that make them more likely to end up with ASPD, but if their environmental factors are different, it can affect their outcome, basically. The environmental factors that can actually make somebody more likely to end up with ASPD would include conflict between their caregivers, inconsistent parenting, or drug and alcohol influence in their caregivers while they're in childhood. All of that, if they experience it, could contribute to them having an antisocial personality disorder diagnosis later in life. And to receive a diagnosis for ASPD, a person needs to show a pattern of at least 3 of the following traits. 1, doesn't respect social norms or laws and consistently breaks laws or oversteps social boundaries. 2, lies, deceives others, uses false identities or nicknames, and uses others for personal gain. 3, doesn't make any long-term plans and often behaves without considering the consequences. 4, shows aggressive or aggravated behavior, consistently gets into fights or physically harms others. 5, doesn't consider personal safety or the safety of others. 6, doesn't follow up on personal or professional responsibilities, included repeatedly being late for work, not paying bills on time, etc. And 7, doesn't feel guilt or remorse for having harmed or mistreated others. So when we think about psychopaths, we don't usually think about people who are late to work, have trouble making long-term plans, and don't respect social norms, right? Those three things, though, could potentially end you up with a diagnosis for ASPD. But they also could describe like half the friends I've had in my life, right? I alone could fall into number 1, not respecting social norms, number 4, aggressive or aggravated behavior, and number 6, having trouble with personal or professional responsibilities, like paying bills on time, which I'm only really able to do because I set up auto pay one day on all of my accounts. Otherwise, the ADHD would have taken over and I would never pay a bill again, probably. And as it turns out, ASPD also isn't that helpful in the case of carceral prison type settings because it's just pretty broad. 80% of prison inmates meet the criteria for ASPD, leading some critics to say that psychiatry is attempting to pathologize crime by making up disorders that are just synonymous with criminality, which is a problem, right? Because what is and is not a crime changes from community to community and over time. It's not objective, and at any rate, just having committed a crime is not in itself a disorder. You could easily have an ASPD diagnosis and be not at all the bloodthirsty murdering psychopath we think of in our heads. It's like the caricature of evil, right? And there are even proven treatment methods for ASPD. CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy, has been helpful, as has mentalization-based therapy, or MBT. Medications like mood stabilizers, antidepressants, and SSRIs can also treat ASPD. A lot of these, and especially cognitive behavioral therapy, are recommended also for children who suffer from head injuries, which is going back to that idea we were talking about linking psychopathic behavior and brain trauma. So now you might be thinking, like, well, psychopaths are different than this, right? They're not just disorganized thrill seekers who listen to punk rock and sometimes break the law, right? We have this character in our head that they're selfish, self-involved people who think that they're special. And as it turns out, that kind of thought process is why psychopaths also get lumped in with this other real, actual diagnosis in the DSM. Narcissistic personality disorder.
Ooh.
Yeah, so Kenna, what do you think of when you think about narcissism?
Just someone who thinks the world revolves around them and they're number 1, everyone else is number 2. The world is there to serve them, kind of like main character disorder. Main character syndrome.
Lead singer disorder.
Lead singer disorder. But in a way that's like harmful to other people.
Yeah, so basically narcissistic personality disorder is marked by a pattern of self-important or grandiose behavior, like exaggerating achievements and expecting to be recognized as superior, fantasies of unlimited success, power, beauty, or perfect love. The perfect love one I think is interesting. A belief of importance, specialness, and uniqueness that only other high-status people could possibly understand. A need for excessive admiration, a sense of entitlement, such as unreasonable expectations of favorable treatment, a tendency to take advantage of others for personal gain, a lack of empathy, envy of others, and the belief that others are envious of them or of other people too, an arrogant, condescending behavior or attitudes. So this differs from ASPD and the antisocial personality disorder thing in that it does not come along with the need to be admired or envied by others. ASPD doesn't. But by contrast, people with narcissistic personality disorder also tend not to cause a disorder or engage in criminal behavior with such prevalence. So something interesting that I found is that while 1 in 100 people would test positively on the PCLR for psychopathy, only half of that would test positively for narcissistic personality disorder, which is shocking because I feel like so many people say that they have dated narcissists, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So I don't know, maybe we're a little heavy-handed on that assessment of narcissism?
Possibly.
Yeah, because I'm thinking like just colloquially, I've heard a lot of people talk about narcissists they have met, but like hardly anybody is like, I met a psychopath.
Huh, yeah.
Right? In reality, narcissistic personality disorder is pretty rare. It is, though, more common in certain industries.
Interesting.
Yeah. Do you have any guesses for what jobs might be most attractive to people with narcissistic personality disorder?
Oh, acting?
No. It is the military and medical.
Oh,
Yeah.
Actually, the doctor's thing makes sense.
It does. 17% of first-year medical students and 20% of people in the military have NPD, but the general population has just 0.5%.
Interesting.
Yeah.
You know, this is just I was thinking about how, like, you know, doctors just, like, I feel like tend to gaslight so many people and be like, are you sure it's not in your head? Like, you're feeling pain? Like, there's so many common stories about, like, women or people of color, like going to the doctors and not being believed. And I'm just like, whoa.
Yeah, it might be a thing about like reflection of self, you know?
But also, this is just me anecdotally, my brain.
Right. So the reality is that lots of these traits that we associate with narcissism, they're actually just pretty common traits. Like, we are human and we need to be loved. But pathological narcissism, or NPD, is an extreme variation of these very human qualities, which I think explains why so many people think that they have dated narcissists, when statistically that would actually be pretty rare. According to the DSM-5, though, which is the most recent version of the DSM that we have, NPD comes with significant impairments in personality functioning, like looking excessively to others for regulation of self-esteem, viewing oneself as exceptional, having impaired empathy, and having mostly superficial relationships, along with those personality traits we mentioned earlier of grandiosity and also attention-seeking. Pathological narcissism is maladaptive, rigid, persistent, and causes significant distress and functional impairment. These qualities remain relatively stable over time and are not caused by like medical conditions, drug use, or a person's developmental stage. Research shows that although people with NPD experience high self-esteem, it's also fragile and insecure, and their self-esteem fluctuates from moment to moment and day to day. Yet, people with NPD are more likely to rate their self-esteem as high rather than low. And this suggests that although people with NPD describe themselves in positive terms, their non-conscious feelings are not necessarily so positive. So just like ASPD, NPD is what's called a cluster B personality disorder. Have you ever heard of these?
Mm-mm.
So basically, the personality disorders in the DSM are separated into 3 clusters. Cluster A personality disorders cause eccentric behavior. So they include things like paranoid, schizoid, and schizotypal personality disorders. Cluster C personality disorders cause anxious behavior and include things like avoidant, dependent, and obsessive-compulsive personality disorders. So that's me. I'm in that one, I think. And then right in the middle there, we have cluster B personality disorders, which is when someone has trouble regulating their emotions and behavior. Other people might consider their behavior dramatic, emotional, or erratic. And included in cluster B personality disorders, we have antisocial, borderline, histrionic, and narcissistic personality disorders. And the thing about cluster B personality disorders is that we tend to vilify them due to the damage that it can cause others when the person suffering from the disorder is oblivious to their condition. And the reality is that they often do leave the person who's inflicted with these disorders in a state of extreme emotional distress themselves, especially if they don't have a diagnosis or aren't really sure why they're doing the things they're doing. And these are the types of personality disorders that get commonly linked in with this idea of psychopathy. But, you know, we talk about psychopathy, we tend to view it as this idea of evil, right? But in reality, the closest diagnoses that we have, these cluster B personality disorders, these aren't evil people, right? They're people who are suffering from a medical condition that needs treatment. But we tend not to, like, think about them this way. Whereas, like, cluster A personality disorders or cluster C personality disorders, people have a lot more empathy for those, or sympathy at the very least.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the other cluster B personality disorders that kind of gets lumped in with this idea of psychopathic behavior as we think of it is borderline personality disorder, which is a really hard one. According to Medical News Today, borderline personality disorder causes instability in mood, behavior, and self-image. And a person with this condition may experience intense emotions leading to a poor self-image and a lot of impulsive behavior, which might be why the impulsivity people tend to vilify and associate with like this idea of psychopathy. A lack of stability in relationships is also a main characteristic of this condition, and it affects 1.4% of adults in the U.S., and women are more likely to receive this diagnosis than men. And features of borderline personality disorder include a fear of being abandoned, attempts to avoid abandonment, unstable relationships that shift from extreme adoration to extreme dislike, intense or extreme moods like anger, depression, emptiness, anxiety, stress-related paranoia or dissociation, sudden or impulsive shifts in values or career plans, impulsive harmful behaviors like substance abuse, self-harm, and for some, suicidal thoughts or actions. And people with this condition may react with intense anger or sadness in situations that others would not consider distressing. This can cause difficulties in relationships and can contribute to a poor sense of self-esteem. And people with borderline personality disorder tend to experience intense and unstable emotions and moods that can shift fairly quickly. They generally have a hard time calming down once they become upset. As a result, they frequently have angry outbursts and engage in impulsive behaviors like substance abuse or risky sexual liaisons, self-injury, or overspending to soothe themselves. And they also tend to see the world in oversimplified all or nothing terms. So they might apply harsh, either or judgments to others and themselves and their perceptions of like the quality of themselves or others. Like, this person is all good, this person is all bad, I am all good, or I am all bad. And this can lead to an unstable sense of self. That like unstable sense of self can also be the thing that contributes to changes in careers, relationships, life goals, residences, and they're usually radical changes that occur without any warning or advanced preparation. And this kind of like black and white thinking or all or nothing thinking, it makes it easy for people suffering from borderline personality disorder to misinterpret the actions and motivations of others around them. So an example of this might be, say you're dating someone and they forgot your anniversary. So if you're engaged in this black and white thinking, you might think, wow, this person doesn't love me anymore. They forgot my anniversary or our anniversary. So if they don't love me, that must mean they hate me. And then imagine you think that the person that you're with hates you. That would lead to intense emotions of rejection, abandonment, sadness, and anger, which are obviously hard to deal with. And it could lead you to become overwhelmed. So in order to gain control, you might want to do something to make the feelings go away. And you might, confront your partner. You might accuse them of having an affair. They might be like, what are you talking about? Where did this come from? And then you might be like, please, just don't leave me. This might baffle them and like make them angry and actually make them leave you. And after your partner leaves, then you might engage in risky behavior to soothe yourself due to your lack of impulse control. Then when your partner finds out about this, they might feel manipulated as though you're doing it to get their attention or try to get them to come back to you. It's marked by distorted thought patterns and intense unregulated emotions and makes interpersonal relationships difficult to maintain, as well as making other people think that maybe you have no empathy or you're just selfish, when in reality you're having a heightened emotional experience that makes it hard for you to relate to the rest of the world. However, because other people might interpret that behavior as being super selfish, they can easily lump you in with this kind of vilified idea from the criminology perspective of psychopathy. And one of the causes of borderline personality disorder is thought to be suffering verbal abuse in childhood. So as we see, it's like these cluster B personalities that are often vilified. They're really hard experiences for people suffering with these personality disorders to have. And I think a lot about the way we talk about like narcissism in particular, and obviously having a personality disorder doesn't absolve you of your treatment of other people. But like for me, okay, if I have like a cluster C personality disorder or whatever, which is obsessive compulsive disorder, that's something I have. Usually when I tell people that, they're pretty sympathetic for my situation. They're like, wow, that must be really hard. Like, I can imagine that what you're going through is difficult, even if it doesn't make sense to me. But I often find that in society, we don't grant that same consideration to people suffering from these cluster B personality disorders. And the last kind of cluster B personality disorder that often gets mixed up or confused with this weird idea of psychopathy is histrionic personality disorder.
Oh, I didn't realize that was a thing. Because I think about old-timey, like, they were in histrionics.
Yeah, well,
this hysterical woman.
Yeah, it is kind of a gendered thing, right? And it's an extremely emotional and attention-seeking, like, disposition. So a person with histrionic disorder may appear lively, enthusiastic, charming, and flirtatious. They might act in a way that's considered inappropriate, especially in places like work or school. And some people estimate that 2% of the population meets the criteria for histrionic personality disorder, but women are 4 times as likely to receive the diagnosis.
Interesting.
Right. So features of histrionic personality disorder include feeling uncomfortable when you're not the center of the attention, behaving in ways that other people might perceive as overly sexual or provocative, having rapidly changing shallow emotions, using dramatic theatrical expressions and emphasis when expressing emotion, using physical appearance to draw attention, being easily influenced by others, and believing and behaving as if others are closer to you than they actually are. So a person with this disorder tends to believe that their behavior is pretty typical and might not understand that what they're doing is any different than what other people are doing, and that's where it kind of causes them problems. People often receive this diagnosis later in life, and their patterns of behavior have already by this point interfered with their personal and professional relationships. And a lot of this, like wanting to be the center of attention or overly sexual activity or, shallow emotions, this can all kind of cross over with that behavior that criminologists talk about as psychopathy. Although out of these 4 different cluster B personality types, this one is least likely to have crossover with the psychopathy test in general. And I do think that is because it does have more gendered connotations, personally. We tend to think of histrionic activity as being more feminine and psychopathic behavior as being more masculine. Another potential cause of this overrepresentation, though, with women or feminine adjacent people is much sadder, and it's that histrionic personality disorder is usually a trauma response to sexual abuse, which would disproportionately affect young women and girls compared to young men and boys. So, okay, if we have these 4 different types of cluster B personality disorders that tend to be more specific and deal with ways to actually help people with what they're going through in life, which these are really difficult experiences to have, not only for yourself, but for the people around you that you care about. Why do we even need the term psychopath? Like, what is the term psychopathy doing for our society, and why does it persist? So, in this book, The Myth of the Born Criminal, these 2 Canadian psychologists, Stephanie Griffiths and Michael Marron, worked with the criminologist Jerka Jalanva to argue that psychopathy is a flawed and ill-defined concept, and that neuroimaging data doesn't support it as a diagnosis, but rather shows brief correlations to traumatic brain injuries and aggression, which are separate from psychopathy as a term or idea. Instead, psychopathy doesn't come from science. It comes from society's understanding of deviance, which is an amorphous and generational term. One thing they write is like that it's similar to the term jerk, right? Like if someone's a jerk, it doesn't actually constitute or imply a real thing. It's just a linguistic convention for displaying moral disapproval. And they say that the term psychopath is kind of the same as that. As Peter Vigneron explains in Pacific Standard, to the extent that psychopaths explain anything, they serve to highlight society's fears and neuroses and allow us to rationalize and remove ourselves from the human tendency towards evil. So if we strip away the complexity regarding the diagnosis of psychopathy and antisocial personality disorder, what we're left with, I think, is the fundamental question: how do we make a society where people aren't a danger to others?
Yeah,
right?
Because I feel like by calling someone a psychopath, you resolve yourself of any social responsibility, because they're just this like innate person who's just evil, like in a vacuum,
right? And I feel like that's the crux of why we care about these sort of things. The reality is that categorizing people by their likelihood to commit crimes alone is not going to answer this question for us, because crime and danger aren't necessarily synonymous. And I think the more important thing is to meet people where they are and like resist the urge to demonize or to humanize people, even when they do heinous, unspeakable things to others. Labeling someone as a psychopath does. It allows us to distance ourselves from the role our society has played in whatever act of violence or aggression happened. It allows us to wash our hands and say, yeah, nothing could be done. They were just born bad. When in reality, what we see is that people are not born bad. They are often a victim of their circumstances. Traumatic brain injuries, inadequate parenting, addiction issues, lack of access to mental health care. These are all things our society does have a role in. And establishing a social safety net where we provide for these things is ultimately how we, yes, make a society where people are not a danger to others. So as Gabrielle C.S. Gavin explains in Psychology Today, psychopathy as a concept is dangerous. It seduces us into the belief that people who do really terrible things do so for motivations we would never be capable of sustaining. It puts us beyond the pale of ever being able to do the same and reduces the scrutiny that we apply to our own actions. It prevents us from always bearing in mind that there is indeed evil in the world, but the people who commit it are just like you and me. And the reality is that a lot of these people who would be classified as psychopaths, not actually Kenna and the loaded test I gave her at the beginning of the episode, maybe, but other people, they are, yeah, pretty much just like you and me. One man, Dr. James Fallon, was a successful neuroscientist at UC Irvine who ran a brain scan on himself and was shocked to find that it matched the scans of people who had assessed positively as psychopaths on that psychopath checklist. Like theirs, his brain scan showed drastically diminished activity in specific areas of the frontal and temporal lobes linked to empathy, morality, and self-control. And when he asked his family, like, hey, do you guys think I'm a psychopath? He was shocked to find that they all were like, well, yeah. They all were like, look, you're kind of cold. You're superficially charming. You do a lot of really wild risk-taking behavior. But you're also bold and you're methodical, and these are good things. And what he realized is that even though his family knew he lacked warmth and empathy, they still liked him and they wanted him to be in their lives and they liked having him around. And he felt the same way about them. He realized that he was what people sometimes called a pro-social psychopath. He pointed out that there's a constant number of these types of people in all sorts of societies and asked, do we really want our surgeons to be empathetic when they're doing surgery, or do we want somebody who's cold and calculated? Fallon found that he himself might not have the natural instinct to empathize with others, but he knew it was morally right to treat others with dignity and respect. Researchers consider this the effect of conscientiousness, planning for the future, being goal-directed, following rules, being self-disciplined, and delaying gratification, which, if not naturally occurring in someone, can be learned and contribute to a person's success in society, whatever success means. In attempting to find the role that people who tested positively for psychopathy but had not entered lives of criminality played in society, a psychologist named Adrienne John R. Galang assessed artists and found that many highly creative people also have personality traits similar to those of psychopaths. They have an emotional disinhibition, that expresses itself in art. While acclaimed as revolutionary and pioneering visionaries, the same category of people can come across as unsocialized and discomforting, even to their close associates and admirers, he noted. And I can't help but think that the main benefit of a psychopathy assessment in the context of the carceral system is the benefit of intentionally dehumanizing inmates. If we've created a way to categorize people which applies to up to 80% of the prison population and dehumanizes people and makes us think they are evil, it's easier for us to turn away from the injustices occurring in our prison system every day. Our prisons are faced with rampant abuse at the hands of guards, which, roaming gangs of white supremacist law enforcement officials violently attack inmates of color and sometimes kill them without provocation. There's also rampant sexual assault within prison walls, as well as overcrowding, lack of access to healthcare, inhumane isolation, which leads to really high rates of suicide, and forced slave labor that benefits major corporations all around the globe. More than half of all Americans in prison or jail suffer from mental illness, and instead of being compassionate about this, it's easy for us as the unincarcerated public to decide that the only mental illness they probably suffer from in prison or jails is just psychopathy, which isn't even a real mental illness. It allows us to justify the horrific treatment of prisoners in this system by stripping them psychologically of their humanity in our minds. They aren't people, they're deviant criminals, psychopaths. They don't deserve safety or treatment or second chances. But psychopathy is not a mental health diagnosis. It's a criminal justice diagnosis, and our society loves copaganda. It's another way to make the cops the good guys and anyone who breaks the law a monster. So this kind of ties in with this idea. Have you heard this before, that people are like, psychopaths can't be reformed?
It kind of sounds like it from what you've said, where it's just because if someone's born a monster, what can you really do?
Right. So there's this idea that does persist, that people who display traits that can be associated with psychopathy can never change their behavior, perhaps tied to how we've dehumanized and othered them and stripped them from their own identity as people. In reality, there hasn't been a real and proper experiment on reducing violent impulses associated with traumatic brain injuries or cluster B personality disorders, probably because the medical community doesn't recognize psychopathy as a formal diagnosis to be studied, right? The experiments that have been conducted lacked proper experimental design and scientific validity and have fallen under huge amounts of scrutiny. But contrary to this idea that psychopaths are just evil people who are born bad and have no chance of being cured, there actually is a lot of promising research that people who are officially diagnosed with specific cluster B personality disorders, like antisocial personality disorder, for example, they can definitely be treated. In one study on antisocial behavior in high-risk juvenile offenders, treatment emphasizing interpersonal relationships and social skill acquisition was correlated with marked decreases in criminal recidivism and particularly violent recidivism compared to high-risk youth who did not receive this treatment. The treatment was an intensive year-long cognitive behavioral therapy, and it did, lead to less violent outcomes by targeting the participants' ability to provide impulse control to their aggression. And this makes sense to me because I don't know if it's the ADHD or what, but growing up, I have always struggled with impulse control, and I've been a really aggressive person. And as I get older, I've done a pretty good job, I think, of being able to curb a lot of my more aggressive and violent impulses. And I just see that happening over time because I recognize that if I want to exist in society, my life is going to be a lot easier if I learn how to curb those violent and aggressive impulses. And I think it's just this idea that rather than seeing people for who they are and seeing society for who it is and actually trying to solve problems, we like to take the idea of individual accountability so far that we create an evil mythical monster and we dress it up like a man and we say that thing is just evil and there's no reforming evil.
Yeah, because it's easier to be like, that person is bad, to be like, whoa, we have to change basically everything that we've been doing. Like, instead of like locking people away and punishing them, we need to figure out how to like integrate them in society or make society function so when bad things happen, you know, it doesn't spill over into a tragedy.
Right. And I think an important thing is, like, I think about this a lot, like, as a mentally ill person, like, there's no excuse for doing bad things that harm other people.
No.
Right?
I think we're all for accountability, and there's no excuse for, like...
Right. Like, definitely. Like, if I do something fucked up, I'm not like, oops, teehee, that was just my ADHD, or that was just my OCD, my bad. Like, no, definitely you still have to take accountability for your actions. But I think, like, in particular, being realistic about what's going on in our brains is the best way to allow us to move forward with our own treatment, like, on the issue of personal accountability. How can you be personally accountable for your actions if you don't know your best course of treatment to adjust and fix your actions in the future? And as long as we let these ideas persist that that things like psychopathy, which is a criminal justice diagnosis, is actually somehow a psychiatric diagnosis, as long as we let that continue, people will have mixed signals about the best way to actually move forward with things like rehabilitation, with doing better in the future, with actually reducing things like violent outbursts or violent crime or whatever. And also, obviously, the big overarching thing that we mentioned earlier is that mental illness does not correlate with crime. And we see that in trying to make up all these diagnoses like psychopathy, they're trying to come up with a way to say that all criminals are mentally ill or that mental illness is what causes all crime, which again, we see like, no, people who commit crime, there's so many different factors that play into it. And a lot of those can just be money.
And, you know, crime, like you said, is also a social construct. It's something we create. What is a crime and what is not? And that changes over time. What society used to consider a mental illness and a crime, for example, like being gay is like not considered that anymore. And like, I feel like there's so many different steps that we have to take into account in society that a lot of times people think it's just easier to be like, people are fucked up. Shove them in a hole.
Exactly. Yeah. Throw them away, like lock them up, throw away the key, just be done with it. But I think there's like something to be said about the intersection of like where it's good to know what's going on with us. Like for me, I just know that like a diagnosis has been so helpful in me figuring out my own brain. Mm-hmm. And because also when you have a diagnosis, you have access to better, like more personalized resources.
Yeah. Or like, for example, like with ADHD, it's like, schools can be really hard for kids with ADHD because schools are set up for people to work in a factory or like work in an office, you know, sitting down for a long amount of time, which is not conducive to many children. And that's why a lot of people with ADHD become entrepreneurs, because they can jump around and do things on their own instead of having to sit and be focused in the same space for like 8 hours.
Right. And what we also see, I think, is that like your access to resources affects your outcome, even if you do have like a personality disorder of some kind. Mm-hmm. Like I think about the guy who was the neurologist at UC Irvine. And when he scanned his brain, he found the same like brain scan issues that could lead to like, you know, lack of impulse control and, you know, lack of empathy and all of this stuff. But because he had access, I'm guessing, to resources, he was able to attend college and enter this field and build this like pretty quote unquote normal life. But somebody with those same issues in a situation where they also were dealing with not having enough money to afford to eat or live.
Yeah. And also, like you said, like those traits that are considered quote psychopathy, for the doctor helped in his field. For example, you know, being able to work with medical stuff. You know, for some people, that would be too emotional. For me, no.
Right.
I am not dealing with the body, blood, guts, anything like that. But for someone else, that could be a real asset.
Yeah, it's like there are different ways to like channel our strengths and our weaknesses, but as long as we're vilifying anybody who's ever committed a crime ever, or, you know, as long as we're refusing to look at actual cause and effect with the like intended goal of making our societies better and safer and nicer places for us all to live.
Yeah.
We're never going to get there.
Yeah, it's funny. Okay, it is funny to me how we're such an individualistic society. Like we put the onus on on individual responsibility instead of the systems that we set up. Yet, all this carceral punishment stuff actually fails to take into account the individual and each individual circumstance.
Because they are also different.
Mm-hmm.
A thing I thought was really interesting is that if we know that like traumatic brain injuries can affect our brain's development, and specifically in places like impulse control and like social learning and things like empathy, but we found that when people suffering from traumatic brain injuries are immediately treated with cognitive behavioral therapy, it reduces the long-term effects that has on them.
Yeah, and I don't understand why that's not more of an option than just locking someone up.
Right. And I think like, I don't know. I think it's hard because the things that I think about that I've said in this episode where I'm like, wow, people might really feel a certain type of way of that is where I'm like, wow, I have sympathy for people who are struggling with narcissistic personality disorder. That sounds really stressful for them, you know? And I think like people are probably not going to respond well to hearing that.
No, because it doesn't negate the harm that they do.
Right. It doesn't negate that.
And it's like, it's not that you don't want to hold that behavior accountable and figure out how to curb or eliminate that destructive behavior.
Right. You want to take people who are struggling with these issues and recognize that, you know what, it must be pretty hard for them as well. And you want to offer resources to help everybody, to help people around them so that they don't harm someone else.
Yeah. And it's hard because you have to hold those two things in your brain where it doesn't excuse the bad behavior.
Right.
But it explains it.
Right. Right. And it helps, like I think like the thing I think about a lot is like, what's the goal? And for me, like I mentioned this earlier, it's like the goal is to have safe and healthy and happy societies where we cause the least amount of harm to one another as possible. And you cannot do that if you have a block up to understanding the why of the harm happening.
Yeah. You
have to be able to, like you said, like hold people accountable for their actions 100%. But also, while doing that, understand that you're allowed to look at the why and be like, okay, yeah, this is not an excuse, but it is an explanation. And if we don't want this to happen again, we should work on tackling that.
Yeah, and it's hard because honestly, sometimes it involves a lot of experimentation, you know? Like to be like, okay, this is how we make sure this, you know, either set up a boundary, set up a system, like work with the individual and the other person, and each individual situation could be different.
That's true, yeah.
It's hard.
It's interesting because doing this episode, I didn't realize it would kind of become a prison abolition episode.
I mean, I think it really is because the idea of the psychopath is like, it lumps so many things together, like personal responsibility. There are some people who are just bad eggs. You know, the state has no control over these people. You know, where it's like so many different, you know, where does personal accountability fall, which is that's a big question. And
also the issues of like being punitive versus preventative.
And I would say probably most research would say that being punitive does not work.
No, it does not. It actually increases people's risks of like committing crime or reoffending in some way in the future. And depending on your definition of crime and what you're including, you know, that could be an issue tied to public safety for sure. So, I don't know. I thought this was just, like, really interesting because I had always heard about, like, psychopathy. And then I started to hear other people be like, that's not real. And I was like, I think it's real. I think it can't just be a throwaway term, though. And once I started looking into it, I was like, oh, I get it. No, it's not real in the DSM. It's not a real diagnosis. And that, I think, was, the most interesting thing. I think it is a way to try to say, some people in our criminal justice system, they are beyond the point of return and they do not deserve a second chance.
Yeah, it's just like when people are like the serial killers and the super predators, you know, it's the way to be like, there are monsters roaming around, and it's easy to lump more and more people into that category because it's easy.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And it is propaganda. It is this idea, who will protect you from the monsters in the street? And then, you know, whenever you talk about prison abolition, people always ask, well, like, what about the serial killers?
Yeah, because it'd be like, because you're just like, no, you don't want to excuse bad behavior. You don't want to excuse horrific terrible, absolutely like unjustifiable behavior. You know what I mean?
And that's the interesting thing, though, about prison abolition is that since prisons don't deter that type of behavior, according to all statistics, prison abolition actually seeks to hold people accountable and stop that behavior.
Yeah, it's like preventing the behavior and holding that behavior accountable for after it happens. But to me, it's mainly about prevention.
It's mostly about prevention, for sure. And holding people accountable after crimes do occur has to do with centering the victims and the victims' needs. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I think that, I don't know, I just thought it was interesting how I didn't expect this episode to take that many twists and turns, I guess, you know?
That's so funny because that's immediately where I went to.
You did! The first sentence, you knew. Yeah. But I did think the cluster B personality disorders, it is interesting because each and every one of those things also, as I heard them, I'm like, damn, we really talk shit about these people so hard in society, you know?
And it's really hard.
It's really hard. Like, I know people who have those diagnoses, and I know they struggle with them, and I know they're good people with good intentions who, you know, and our society just, it's very vilified. It is very like, these are evil people.
Well, I mean, and it is like our society really wants to equate mental illness with crime.
We do. That's all we want to do. But even as a mentally ill person, I'm like, I've committed some crimes because of my mental illness. Which I'm not a monolith. I'm not speaking for everyone. I'm speaking for myself.
Oh, I know. But sometimes I'm like, me going like the extra like galaxy brain, maybe ADHD brain is just like, well, should have they been crimes in the first place?
No, they should not have. And
like,
also,
I'm all drug use should not be a crime.
No, it should not. And
I'm all promiscuity, not a crime.
No.
In fact, cool.
Very cool. Also shoplifting. I don't think that should be a crime.
No, because my hot take is money shouldn't exist.
Right, exactly. Money shouldn't exist. How is shoplifting a crime? But also, I think that I personally would have benefited from early access to mental health care. So the thing that gets me is the people who are like, all of the crime is by mentally sick people. I'm like, well, if you really believe that, do you want to give us some resources and help us out a little?
Well,
or what?
I mean, in many states, I feel like still on the books, like in Texas, like sodomy is a crime.
Wow.
Like, and most people be like, wait, what? That's a crime. That is the most enjoyable crime. Like some people would be like, that is not a, you know what I mean? Like there are some crimes that are, people would be like, wait, what?
Yeah. So I think in the end, it's crime cannot be equated to mental illness. However, resources should be given for people struggling with mental illness issues.
Oh, for sure.
And the things we think of as crime, most of them shouldn't even be crime. Also, money shouldn't exist, and psychopathy is propaganda.
Yes.
Are those all the points?
Yeah, there are no psychos.
There are no psychos except for Kenna.
I'm the one. Thank you so much for listening to us. If you would like to support us further, you can subscribe to our Patreon at patreon.com/pickmeupimscared. For a mere $2 a month, you can support us, leave messages asking us questions, and you can also hear bonus content. Or you don't have to do anything. We love that you're here and listening. Thanks again.